Sorry, I can't see it, so I couldn't tell.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Laura Hart, Water Policy Analyst and the Rules Coordinator for this role.
Fantastic. And I am also going to start with the individuals who are on the rule. Oh, actually, Kelly, if you could please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Kelly Mines. I am a policy analyst for OWRD/Rule Writer, Rule Coordinator.
Thank you. And next, I'm going to go to the Rules Advisory Committee members, just based on the order in which they appear on the screen for me. And so we're going to go to Brad.
Hello, my name is Brad Parrish. I'm the Water Rights Specialist here for the Department of the Klamath Tribes.
Thank you. Misty.
There we go. My name is Misty Buckley and I live in Klamath Falls.
Thank you. Okay. Dave.
Yes, I'm Dave Wildman with Anderson Perry in Eastern Oregon and involved with several groundwater municipal well development projects.
Thank you. Karen.
Wow, there's so many little buttons to click. Hi, Karen Lowatsky here from Oregon Environmental Council. I'm the Water Policy Program Director and the Rural Partnerships Lead for that organization. And I suspect the reason I'm here is because I've had a lot to do with groundwater in the lower Umatilla area, but also in other parts of Oregon, both water quality and water quality. And I'm really glad to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Lauren.
Hi, Lauren Poor, Oregon Farm Bureau. And I guess I'm supposed to say why I'm here, and I represent all the farmers and ranchers who need water for their crops.
Thank you. Lisa.
Yeah, Lisa Brown. I'm a staff attorney with Water Watch of Oregon, and I've worked on groundwater a lot in the state for probably 10 years or more, and I'm excited to see this RAC moving forward.
Thank you. Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick Seiler. I'm the Associate State Climatologist for the state of Oregon, and I'm an Assistant Professor of Atmospheric Science at Oregon State, where I study the hydrologic cycle, including sort of changes in precipitation patterns in the Northwest.
Thank you. Obi.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Obi Strickler. I'm a geologist by training. We now run one of the larger cannabis producers in Southern Oregon with both indoor and outdoor. So water availability and those things are extremely important to us down here in the southern part of the state.
Thank you. Phil.
Hi, I'm Phil Brown. I'm a consulting hydrogeologist. I mostly work on water supply and wells for cities and specialize in aquifer storage and recovery.
Thank you. Robin.
Hi, I'm Robin Cook with GSI Water Solutions, also a consulting hydrogeologist in CWRE. I work with municipalities, ag and industrial clients around the state.
Thank you. Tammy.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm Tammy Wood, currently retired. I'm speaking from my home office in Portland. I retired from about 2 years ago after a 28-year career as a surface water hydrologist with the USGS, Oregon Water Science Center. I worked on a variety of investigations over the course of my career, notably in the Klamath and Harney basins. And in my retirement, I am serving on the board of the Oregon Lakes Association, which currently has a focus on the closed basin lakes in Eastern Oregon and an interest in the interaction of the extraction of groundwater with inflows to those lakes. Thanks.
Thank you. I need to go back. Margaret, did I call on you?
No, you didn't.
Didn't think so. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm Margaret Durner in Halfway, Oregon. Retired Forest Service employee. Just, this seems real important. Water is life. And I care about the rights of nature and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Tyler.
Oh, hello. I think I finally got it. Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
All right. My name is Tyler Hufford. I work out in North Powder on my family's farm. We have 3 wells and just seems like an important process to be a part of.
Thank you. Before I go to the Rules Advisory Committee members in the room, I know we've got quite a few more people who have joined us virtually. Is there any Rules Advisory Committee member that I missed?
Yeah, good morning. This is Zach Fried with the Nature Conservancy.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No problem. Thanks, Annette. Nice to see everybody. I am Zach Fried. I lead the Sustainable Water Program for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon. I'm calling in from Bend, and I've been working on groundwater quantity and quality issues in the Pacific Northwest for about 10 years now. I had a front row seat to the consequences of groundwater over allocation in the Harney Basin, where I've worked with that community for about 5 years now.
Thank you. And Kelly, please introduce yourself.
Morning, everybody. Kelly Warren with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. I am with the Department of Natural Resources. My position is Water Code Administrator. The tribe has an interest in this rulemaking because we're in the process of working on a treaty settlement for our groundwater rights. And we also co-manage with the state within the boundaries of the reservation. And we have, the tribe has ceded grounds throughout the state of Oregon, Washington, California, etc.
Thank you.
I do want to say that I cannot hear everybody in the room. The gentleman to your right, who I believe I know, I couldn't hear him introduce himself.
Okay. Why don't you try again, Justin?
All right. So I'm Justin Iverson. I manage groundwater section for the Oregon Water Resources Department. So how was that, Kelly?
Do we need to?
Thank you. I can hear you.
Okay, beautiful. And Jen.
Hi, everybody. This is Jen Hubert. I'm in Bend, Oregon, and I work for the Deschutes River Conservancy. I'm the senior program manager, and I've managed our state chartered groundwater mitigation bank in the upper Deschutes Basin since 2005.
Thank you. Who have joined us virtually have introduced themselves. Thank you very much. We will go next to the room, and if we could start with you, please, Laura.
I'm Laura Masterson. I'm an organic vegetable farmer in the Willamette Valley growing. I am here just as an interested party because obviously groundwater is important for those of us who are farming. But I also currently serve on the East Multnomah SWCD as a board member and have previously served as a member of the Department of Agriculture Board and the OLEV Board.
Welcome.
I'm Greg Capillas with Pacific Hydrogeology. I'm a consulting hydrogeologist and certified water rights examiner, and I've been working together with and sometimes against the Water Resources Department to serve our mutual clients primarily in the Willamette Valley for the last 20+ years.
I'm Jeff Stone. I serve as the executive director of the Oregon Association of Nurseries. Nurseries are our largest sector of ag, predominantly Willamette Valley based and very dependent on groundwater.
And we did move the owl camera here in the room. Could everybody hear Jeff?
I could, yes.
I could also hear,
Okay.
yes.
Yes.
Good.
Great. Adam,
Good morning. I'm Adam Sussman. I'm a principal with GSI Water Solutions. I'm here on behalf of COCO, the Central Oregon Cities Organization, which is made up of 9 cities in Central Oregon that have a population of over 150,000 people. Most of those cities rely almost exclusively on groundwater. So clearly this is #1 priority for those cities and the people that live within them. COCO's cool, man. Thank you. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Bill Jager. I'm a professor in the Department of Applied Economics at Oregon State University. I work on natural resource, environmental and agricultural issues. I worked a lot on water policy and water scarcity, both in Oregon and outside of Oregon, but in the Klamath Basin, in the Willamette Basin, and currently on a project in Kearney Basin.
thank you. All right, so. Okay, the mic is fine. So just a couple sort of administrative things for the people here in the room. The restrooms are immediately outside this door to your left. The drinking fountains are, you have to go across the bridge and around the corner on the right. We will have 2 breaks during today's meeting, roughly at about an hour and a half apart each. Please feel free to break as you need. I think I want to make sure everybody got their packet of information. And for those people in the room, there are hard copies here as well. And then I think what I want to do is really clarify what we want to accomplish during today's meeting. So we really wanted this meeting to be foundational to make sure everybody kind of has the same understanding, both of sort of the groundwater and the water cycle, and then how the department currently does its groundwater reviews. And then we'll transition, hopefully time permitting, into the actual rule review. So that's kind of our goal for today's meeting. And with that, I will turn it. I'm supposed to go with meeting guidelines. Can we go to the next slide? So we got the introduction. Go ahead. So just a quick reminder sort of on meeting guidelines. I know you've probably seen this before. We're going to treat each other respectfully. For those people who are joining us virtually, if you could please mute when you're not speaking and raise your hand, use the raise hand feature on Zoom. And I will be monitoring for that, and I will be calling on people. I also want to give Casey an opportunity to introduce him or herself, since I haven't met Casey. And Casey is also a Rules Advisory Committee member.
Thank you very much. I'm here on behalf of the Oregon Wine Growers Association. I've been involved with land use and natural resources issue on their behalf for the last 15 years. And I reside in the Walla Walla Valley, Umatilla County.
Great, thank you. And it looks like maybe Sarah has joined us as well.
Hi, Sarah Liliefeld. I'm an attorney at Dunn Kearney and here on behalf of Oregon Cattlemen's Association.
Great, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This slide also says to hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation. I think for purposes of today's meeting, we are very open and comfortable to having you raise your hand during the presentation. We would like to answer questions as they come up, so don't feel like you need to hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation. We will have a time scheduled opportunity for public comments, and that is at 11:30. So with that, I will turn it over to Laura, who's going to walk us through the process and timeline.
Thanks. Just a couple quick slides to orient folks who aren't familiar with how this rulemaking process works and sort of where the RAC fits in, or the Rules Advisory Committee fits into all that. So we start out with some draft rules and a statement of need and fiscal impact. Those are under continuous development as we go through this RAC meeting process. And then we have you folks, the Rules Advisory Committee, who we meet with and get input on those draft documents. And then we finalize a version of the draft rules that we put out for rulemaking, a proposal, if you will. And those draft rules are out for public comment. We conduct one or more hearings to collect input. And then based on all that input, we finalize our sort of final proposal that we take to our commission, to the Water Resources Commission, and ask for their approval. As far as the timeline goes, you all should have received 4 sort of save the dates in a single email, and I will send out calendar invites with those Zoom links as well. But basically, we're currently planning to hold 4 RAC meetings, April through June. It's going to be kind of, see as we go. If we need to add a RAC meeting, we may do that. If we don't need the 4th RAC meeting, obviously we won't, have people meet for the 4th. It's sort of, we just got to wait and see how we progress through the materials. We're sort of targeting to get a notice of rulemaking out and a 60-day public comment period, either August or September. It has to get published in the bulletin, in the Oregon Bulletin, so it's the first of a month. So we, it's August or September is kind of what we're looking at. And then if, depending on the timing of that comment period, holding public hearings, September or October, last day of public comment, either October or November, spending October and November reviewing the input we received from the public, and then hoping to bring something to the commission at their November 2023 meeting for adoption, which would give us an effective rule date of December 2023. And that's a pretty ambitious timeline. Put that out there up front. It just kind of depends on how we can move through things, if we can stick to that timeline. Okay. So this just sort of summarizes the role of the RAC. So, attend and participate, and then also provide information and recommendations regarding both the draft rules, and then at later meetings we get more into the fiscal impacts associated with the rules potentially. And then our role, WRD's role, is to facilitate these meetings, provide that technical support and our expertise, as well as sort of foster these discussions that center around collaboration, and to the extent we can build consensus, so much the better. I think that's it. So I think Justin is up next to give you a little bit of background information, sort of setting the stage for why we're here.
But before we do that, does anybody have questions on process or timeline? Nope. Okay. Justin.
Okay. All right, folks. So let's see. The first part of the meeting here before our first break, want to take the rest of the hour-ish to go through kind of background and foundational stuff. So these, when we start talking about the actual changes to the rules, we've gotten to this point through a fairly long set of conversations with our commission and through public meetings starting in 2016, and want to talk about the background of how we got to the Rules Advisory Committee meeting today. Then want to give a really brief science of groundwater background for the key concepts that underpin the changes that we've drafted, and also a background of how we currently allocate groundwater with respect to the technical review that the groundwater section does, so that we know roughly or broadly where we are starting from, and can point back to that for why we have proposed the changes that we have. So again, as Annette said, feel free to raise your hand, ask questions as we go. This would be great if it was conversation. And I want to start out just by talking about that we're talking about allocation. That might be a term of art to some. So I just want to define right up front in grand terms. The legislature has declared that all water in Oregon belongs to the public. That's a public resource. Allocation is the process by which we permit individual uses of that public resource. So this is the forward-looking process of providing permits to use the public resource to people in the future, right? This is we're just talking about the forward-looking aspect of the water rights system. And again, we're in a prior appropriation system here in Oregon. So in looking forward, these would be the most junior people in that prior appropriation system of an existing suite of water rights. All right, so with that broad introduction, a couple slides on background. I'll refer a few times to this document. That's a timeline. It was called the WRC timeline, parenthesis groundwater allocation, in the email that I sent for folks at home. And it points to much more detailed information over time that's been presented that I'm going to broadly gloss over in the next hour or so. And so I want to point out, if you want to learn more or something piques your interest, these are probably, in my opinion, the best places to go to get more background. That said, we can ask and answer questions and do that right now as well. So I'm going to skip ahead. Again, I mentioned that this, from my perspective, really started back in 2016 when we started to bring groundwater up in commission meetings, having conversations, talking about, what groundwater was, and then in 2017, how we went about allocating groundwater, series of light conversations about the future of groundwater and allocation Oregon with the commission, and some pandemic and planning delays, up to June of 2021, when we had been doing a good deal of work to bring all of our groundwater data into an updated database. And we were at the point where we could analyze that data broadly for the state, and we conducted an assessment that we presented to the commission in June of 2021 that we framed as a groundwater concerns assessment. And some key takeaways that the commission continued to talk about after that were finding that, looking back a decade, more than 70% of groundwater applications resulted in a permit in areas where we had concern, which are typically areas where there's been a good deal of development. Then 80% of those applications were approved. And in that application review process, which we'll get into later, it was concerning to folks that there was a series of analyses where we had a checkbox that said could not be determined. And so folks had a lot of discussion about what that meant, that cannot be determined. Go ahead, Jeff.
I promise to behave myself. I just have a really quick question that when we talk about permitting.
Yes.
I get that because we have to get a permit in order to do anything in the agricultural world. But exempt wells are not necessarily permitted. There's a start card.
Yep.
And it does make an impact. So I'm just curious if that's all rolled up into, when you look at the concerns.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I know that's predominantly Willamette, and then there's a big swath that's Willamette Valley.
Sure.
So I'm just curious about how you squared that aspect. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just asking how you pulled that up.
I am 90% sure, but I will come back to the next. But I can confirm this.
And
that we
honestly, not a
did-
trick question.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
just
no,
curious.
we did, I don't believe that we explicitly took the use of exempt use wells, and you described it well. It's exempt. An exempt use well is authorized in statute. And because it's authorized in statute, I'll say it's also not part of this rulemaking because we can't change statute, right? So it is what it is. And you described it, I just want to make sure that I acknowledge you described it correctly, that they have a valid water right. Each exempt use has a valid water right. It just is exempt from the permitting process, so they don't have to file an application, get a water right. In the October 2016 materials, we have a graph that shows number of wells approximately and percentage of overall groundwater use. And exempt use wells are, I mean, it's broad numbers, 90% of all the wells in the state. And the amount of use is about 3%. So not nothing, but relatively small.
My goal of the question was not to conflate the two. I'm just trying to understand how those two, even though they're different piles, how they interact and for the whole, when you're taking a broader view of availability.
Yes.
That's the question I was trying to.
So I just want to note, for the people in the room, it would be helpful if you introduced yourself before you made the
You
comment.
will soon learn to hate my voice, but Jeff Stone, I'm sorry, I apologize.
No problem. And then I also, Kelly has his hand up. And then Misty, I see your comment in the chat. Would you like me to read it or would you like to state it yourself?
This is Misty. I can just restate it. I was just curious and exploring the same thing that Jeff had said.
So it sounds like maybe in a future meeting, we should come back with some data around what we know about exempt wells. And specifically, I think I understood your question to be, how were exempt wells reflected in the groundwater concerns?
I think it can't help but impact at some level unless.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, it certainly causes an impact.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kelly, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I want to address the fact that state controls all water in Oregon, and I'd like to get the state's perspective on what that wording means from your perspective with regards to tribal water rights.
I'm not sure we have the right people in the room to answer that question, Kelly. I think Justin was merely giving an overview of what the current, what's in statute. And I think we probably need to have some input from DOJ on that particular question.
Well, that's interesting. So I just wanted to clear the air on that because that's a lingering concern for me throughout this process and being involved in the process. And when that terminology comes up, it's going to bother me.
Understood. And I think we appreciate and are sensitive to that perspective. And I think as I mentioned, I think Justin was merely trying to summarize what's in state statute. And we acknowledge that it does not reflect the relationship between the tribe and the state, the government to government relationship. So I'll just say that.
Well, we have currently co-managing water rights within the boundaries of the reservation. So Justin is obviously involved with that. So I was just wanting to get Justin's perspective on what that meant to him and his group.
Sure, Kelly, I'm gonna reiterate what Annette said. I was speaking broadly and about the statute as it's termed, and we certainly recognize and value our government to government interaction and understand that we've got water rights settlements with some tribes. We're in the process of developing them with others, and that the tribes retain their sovereignty and Yeah, I want to say that we respect that relationship and I don't want to misspeak on this one, so I'm not going to stretch out too far.
I'm going to continue with just a little bit more comment on it, just so we can clear the air and move forward with the process. I think I need to also, get with my group and see if what comments we should be making at this point on this rulemaking. It's just the start off, and I read that in the first whatever section that was. That, I just want to see what the definition is of state of Oregon. If you're including the reservation in that. And it's confusing, and I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Kelly. Lauren.
Hi, Lauren, Oregon Farm Bureau. I'm sorry, I'm a little slow on my comment, but this is on the timeline. I'm a little curious why we are doing this rulemaking in the middle of the legislative session. I know I'm not the only person that is finding myself trying to juggle this along with the legislative session. I mean, this meeting today is overlapping with the Senate Natural Resources hearing on certified water right examiners. So I'm a little confused why the rush to do this while a lot of us are struggling to balance our water policy portfolios with the legislature. So if we could talk a little bit about why the April to June timeline, when we have a dead, a drop dead date for the legislature of June, we could push it just a little bit, and then we could give it our full attention and actually engage in a more meaningful way.
Lauren, I appreciate the question, and I also appreciate you being here today. And we recognize the challenge of doing this during session. And I would say the reason why we are starting this now is primarily because of the interest of the Water Resources Commission to get this done as quickly as we can. And so that's why we're starting it now. And I think we are certainly open to that conversation if this continues to be a conflict. And so I appreciate your comment. Couple people had their hands up in the room. Greg or Adam, did you want to contribute?
Getting us back on track.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I am Adam Sussman, GSI, on behalf of COCO. Justin, getting us back on track. You wouldn't mind, just because it's a little foggy in my mind, just the high level summary of the criteria in the areas of concern. And with respect to the groundwater portion of that, what kind of outside peer review was conducted?
Are we going to get to that later in the presentation?
Not those particular questions.
But maybe when you get to that map would be the best time to, can we put a pin in that until we get to the map on the concerns? Okay, Greg.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we keep these numbers in perspective here. That 70% of groundwater applications result in a permit and approximately 8% in areas, so-called areas of concern. And I don't know, what happens with all applications, but I just know that every single one that comes across our desk, and I'm sure that most of the other water rights examiners are doing the same thing with their clients, is that they're, familiar with the process and can look at a proposed new use and probably say, at least before this process started, with some certainty whether or not an application was gonna be able to be approved. And so I would have to say that our track record, is, as far as getting applications approved that come to us that are actually submitted, is probably close to 100%, because we evaluate them and we let our clients know whether or not we think they've got a chance. And up until about a year or two ago, we could predict that with pretty good certainty. And so I would say these numbers don't surprise me, because I'm assuming that probably most applicants are going through that process. And so, I would expect to have a very high percentage of success rate.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Back to you, Justin.
Okay. So with the conversation started on the groundwater concerns assessment, 2 meetings down the line for the commission, we presented on our allocation process and Greg's great segue, how and why we believe that the permitting of applications is a relatively large percent. We talked about some of the potential issues with that, and between 2 meetings in December and March, the commission is interested in us assessing the current allocation process, rules, and policy, and coming back with suggestions on being more protective of existing users. Applying a precautionary principle was one term that was used over a couple of meetings at least. And making sure that we are making a positive finding of water availability in making applications. So again, addressing this cannot be determined box. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, this is Greg Capillas again. So yeah, I just want to, I guess, make sure everybody kind of understands it, as I understand it, and I think this was confirmed by what you just said, the whole thing was triggered primarily by the process, and it's a form that the groundwater section uses when they're doing a review. And that groundwater allocation part of the review, there's 3 boxes that have to be checked. One of 3 boxes that needs to be checked, and one is groundwater is over appropriated. The other one is groundwater is not over appropriated. And then the 3rd box is it cannot be determined if groundwater is over appropriated. And I think it was the commission that what started this whole thing was the commission was concerned that permits were being issued even when that box, when it cannot be determined, was checked.
We're gonna walk through the existing review process
Yeah.
that will describe exactly the dynamic that you're
I
referring
guess
to.
I just want
right?
to make sure that everybody kind of understands what really sort of started this whole thing. And what was kind of the basis of the beginning of this process.
Sure, and that came up here in 21-22, but also that was part of the conversation in 2017 as well. So yes, and it has a long history that wasn't the concerns assessment continued the conversation. So
okay, thank
you. Okay, last piece of background I just want to make sure everybody's aware of. After these December 21, March 22 meetings, the department started assessing the current process and coming up with some recommendations for how we might alter it. We took those broad recommendations on a roadshow across the state in September, October 22, and gathered public input ahead of actually making drafting any rule revisions. So there is a report that is, again, it's not on this allocation background because this was part of the handout for that public meeting set, but it's on the website and you can get a summary if you're interested of all the public input that we received. And hopefully for folks that gave public input, you'll recognize some of that implemented in the actual rule revisions when we get there.
Jeff Starr, can you send us a direct link to that?
Sure.
If possible, because if I have to pack, I
Yep.
will fail.
Fair enough.
Miserable.
All right, and so moving away from the background. Thanks, Laura. Then I just want to put this broadly up there again. This was summary condensation of a lot of discussion with the commissioners, but essentially our overall objective in this rulemaking is to update the groundwater allocation rules. So again, that's how we review applications for new permits. And we want to update those to be more sustainable overall and protective of existing water users, both in-stream users and out-of-stream users. So I'm gonna put that back up on the screen. Several slides down to remind us of that, but this is kind of what's guided us in these rule changes.
Okay, and I'd like to pause for just a moment before we move on to key groundwater concepts. I know, I see that another Rules Advisory Committee member has joined us. Cheyenne, if you could please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Cheyenne Holiday. I am now the Energy, Climate, and Transportation Manager at Verde. I was previously the Water Justice Coordinator, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to key groundwater concepts.
Okay, so again, we're gonna have two kind of foundational talks, one regarding science, one regarding our current process. These slides are a subset of those that I gave in this public outreach meeting roadshow, so they'll be familiar to some. Hopefully you'll catch something new the next time around, and to some they might be fresh. So I'm gonna go relatively quickly, but again, raise your hand with any questions. So mostly what I want to get across from foundational groundwater science is make sure that we're thinking about groundwater as a component of the hydrologic cycle. And when we start talking about how we allocate groundwater, we really want to do so with a firm foundation of the source of groundwater pumped from wells, where that groundwater comes from and how that affects the hydrologic cycle as a whole. So first handful, 4 maybe slides are going to be water cycle related. Okay, so first of all, what is groundwater? I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that when we talk about groundwater, we're talking about water that exists in pore space of sediments or fracture space in some volcanic rocks or rocks that have experienced subsequent fracturing. So we're not talking about underground rivers or lakes. We're talking about water that's in this interstitial space. And that water is part of the hydrologic cycle. Hey, Laura, you want to just hand me the keyboard and I can click through? Thank you very much. All right, we'll go from here. Groundwater exists within the water cycle. So I just want to re-emphasize this point to make sure that we keep it in mind that groundwater is recharged through infiltration of dominantly precipitation in its various forms. Once precipitation infiltrates into the ground, it generally is going somewhere and it flows down gradient and it comes out of the ground at some point in many cases. And that discharge is generally to, especially in Oregon with our perennial rivers, that discharge feeds streams and rivers. We call that discharge base flow. This is a zoom in of just a small conceptual block of the water cycle to help us just isolate the things that we're talking about here. So in a real simple system, we have again recharge across the land surface, infiltration to the water table, and once that water joins the groundwater system, it is flowing someplace, and again, often to discharge to a stream. And I just want to make sure that we're thinking about what that means. So precipitation happens variably over time. The movement through the aquifer kind of modulates the inputs to a relatively steady output. And that steady output, if you can imagine, this is one of my visualizations, is this is a stream, has no snowpack above it, has no dams above it. This is late August, early September, after it hasn't rained for several months, and yet I can count on that stream being there to splash around and fish in any time of the year, right? That's what groundwater does for Oregon. Those streams aggregate and create bigger streams that are used for out of stream uses. And that summer base flow is and has been relied upon for a very long time by the earliest users of water in our prior appropriation system. So the groundwater that discharges to that stream is essentially already allocated downstream, right? It's already been accounted for.
Before you move on,
Yep.
Karen, I see your hand. Please go
Oh,
ahead with
thank
your
you.
question.
Yeah, I just want to kind of slightly unpack that simplified drawing that we looked at there, Justin. It's not that I disagree with it, but I think sometimes it neglects to address the fact that we have layers of aquifers. Some are going to be, unconsolidated gravels. Some are going to be beneath a confining bed, and they're going to be fractured basalts, et cetera. When we have such a simplified vision, I don't think it helps people understand that the density of vertical challenges that you can have when you're identifying an aquifer, trying to figure out how much is there, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just throwing that out, and
Fair
it's
enough,
it's not a criticism.
No, that's fine. And I'm sorry. I thought about saying this, and in the interest of time skipped it, but I'll go back and I'll give the caveat that this is a very gross simplification. And again, just to isolate key concepts. So Karen's absolutely right. The subsurface is complex, and the closer you look, the more complex it is. That complexity alters flow, timing, all sorts of aspects. And absolutely, the real world is much messier than this block diagram. And groundwater flow paths still exist. And so the analogy to the arrows here on this slide that are just going straight kind of down into the stream is there can be a tortuous path. They can go deep, they can, rise back up. The timing is highly variable and on a big scale. And in general, as long as there's hydraulic continuity, that molecule of water will eventually get to the stream. So the complexity affects the timing, but not necessarily the ultimate end point of that molecule of water. Okay. Laura.
Is there water in the ground that is not called groundwater?
So yes. So in between the land surface and the water table, we call that the technical term is the vadose zone. There is water in the vadose zone, but there's also air and other gases. So it's got a multi-phase and it operates by different, more complicated physics to describe its movement. But yes, there is, and soil moisture similarly. So.
And well, actually, my question was about, did I misunderstand, or did you say that there is deep water, like lakes or? No. Even if it's not hydrologically connected, even if it's not being recharged, even if it's like.
Yeah, well, so there's always a continuum.
Okay. Okay.
And we can get more and more complex, but certainly like the classic example that many people bring to mind is our Columbia River basalt aquifers on the Umatilla Plateau. They are in their original state, highly layered. They exist in between the lava flows for the most part. And a fault can just separate that. I don't want to say disconnect, but can separate that. And then flow can be more or less difficult along that fault depending on how that fault works. So yeah, it can be more complex, and maybe we'll touch on that later on, come back to that.
And can we pause for a minute? We have another Rules Advisory Committee member who has joined us here in the room. If you could please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Susan Leah-Smith, and I'm a professor at Willamette Law. I teach water law and some intermediate stuff.
Welcome.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna again try and make this point because I'm going to come back to this again and again. Base flow is groundwater discharge, right? That's its definition. And so groundwater is going somewhere, it's discharging somewhere, it's being used or allocated at least in our prior appropriation system. Real quick before I move on, these rules don't necessarily touch on this, but there's a lot more going on with base flow, right? It's generally cooler in the summer than things that have been around in the stream and have had sunlight on them. It's generally been filtered and geochemically can be less polluted than water that's been in surface water for some long period of time. The opposite can be true. Obviously, there's always exceptions to the generalization. But in general, good for fish, good for diluting temperature, TMDL, so on and so forth. All right. Now, returning to the very simple block diagram to describe the source of groundwater from wells. So when a well is installed into an aquifer and starts to pump, kind of two things happen over time to provide water to that well. First of all, you can see that the water table dips down toward the well. That's termed a cone of depression in the water table. That is the well actually pumping in this diagram, in this unconfined diagram. It's actually removing water from what we call storage or dynamic storage. So it's actually dewatering pore space as the water table drops down, and the water that was in that pore space enters the well and gets pumped out. But over time, you can see these flow line arrows that used to come from recharge to the stream. They're now being what we term captured by the well. So that flow that was otherwise on its way to discharge as base flow to the stream in this diagram starts to be captured by the well, and there is less water going to the stream. So
Jeff, do you have a
sorry.
question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
And identify yourself.
Yes, I will lead by example.
All right.
Jeff Stone, Nurseries. So with this example, I was curious to see this example.
Okay.
And is that assuming static draw, I mean, consistent draw all throughout the year? Or does it take into consideration irrigation seasons, which can be finite?
Okay, so this is this Q1, Q is the symbol for flow, 1 is at time step 1. So this is some point after a well starts pumping. I'll get to your point here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move to this next slide and show that we've got a generalized diagram of the source of water to wells. So on the y-axis is percentage of groundwater pumping rate that comes from two types of supply that we just talked about, water from storage. So at early time, when the well is flipped on, 100% of water comes from storage depletion, but that cone of depression spreads out, right? So it's trying to lower the pressure and capture water, if you will. And as that cone of depression spreads out, it's increasingly taking water that was headed someplace else, and that's dominantly stream flow depletion. So generically, that's capture, and specifically in many cases, that's stream flow depletion you can capture from other places. But so it changes over time. Now, if you turn the water in the well off, then that cone of depression needs to fill back up. And so there is continued depletion to the stream even after you turn the well off, as that cone of depression fills back up. That's coming from, these flow paths that would otherwise be discharging to the stream. So there is a lag. And then when that can potentially fill all the way back up to its previous pumping state, right? And so you can get to a steady state point where basically what that means is when you're capturing water, you're capturing it in your example during the irrigation season, and by the next irrigation season, when it rolled around, you're starting from a steady state point, okay? However, going back to Karen's statement, in a more complex system where time periods are longer, or just kind of general geometry of the system, you might not get that cone of depression filled back up by the time the next irrigation season rolls around. And when you turn the pump back on, you're starting from
Right.
some lower state. And over the years, you know, the curve goes up and down that describes where water is coming from, but it's generally rising. So,
Okay, Misty also has a question.
okay.
Misty, please go ahead.
Yes, this is Misty Buckley. Can you go back to the previous slide, please?
Sure.
Thank you. So I'm trying to imagine there's something that confines the water on the bottom and there's something that confines the water on the top. And as you're pumping it out, does the top fall down and collapse and more restrict future flow? Does that question make sense?
I believe so. I think that the most, well, I don't know if it's most well-known, a well-known case of that is found in California Central Valley, where there's very thick unconfined aquifers that are mostly sediment. And when you remove groundwater from the water table, then there's not as much what they call pore pressure, like the pressure of that water pushing out on the pores isn't there, and that pore space can collapse. And that can drop the land surface. Again, in California, they've measured tens of feet in some places of dropped elevation. We haven't witnessed or measured that in Oregon yet, so maybe Greg knows a counterexample. Maybe we have.
Don't forget to introduce yourself.
This is Greg Capillas. Yeah, we have a number of clients out in the Yamhill Valley or Yamhill County area with vineyards, and their wells are obtaining water from fractured marine sediments. And we found that if they over pump those wells, that it seems like they collapse the aquifers, you know, and sometimes pretty large areas around those wells. The fractures themselves are being held up by the hydrostatic pressure, and if they over pump them, then, you know, sometimes those wells go from, I mean, they're never good producers anyway, but they'll go from, you know, maybe producing 15, 20 gallons a minute down to 2. And we found that those effects sometimes spread out quite a bit, you know, around the well. And so they've got to move off quite a distance and drill another well in order to get out of that. So yes, it does happen here in Oregon, but it's not common in the alluvial, you know, the alluvial deposits of the Willamette aquifer, really.
Yeah. So we haven't measured or seen measured any, I'll say California style, Central Valley style subsidence. But yes, it can happen, and a great local example. So. All right. So basically, just looking at this another way, or having it said another way, this was a quote from a 1940 paper, one of the. Oh,
sorry, Robin put a question in the chat.
Okay.
Robin, would you like to state your question rather than have me read it?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. Just on the figure before there, just to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page, that cone of depression will look different depending on the aquifer properties and pumping rates, right? So we'll see a different amount taken out of storage depending on the specific location of the well.
Yeah, absolutely. So aquifer properties will affect the outer edges of the cone of depression, how quickly it propagates, how wide it gets, and to some degree how deep it gets. And then changing the pumping rate, just to be clear, doesn't affect the width of the cone of depression, just the depth. So more pumping rate will mean more depth, but it doesn't mean that it spreads out any less. Okay, that's a interesting groundwater physics tidbit. So all right, so I'm gonna go from there again. Just, I want to wrap this whole thing up, this figure that we saw right here, where water comes from storage, water comes from stream flow depletion, groundwater is just a part of the hydrologic cycle, and therefore recognized as of 1940, or maybe a little earlier, you know, essentially all water that's discharged by wells is balanced by a loss of water somewhere. So it, you know, I've simplified this as the no free lunch policy. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page, that pumping groundwater has consequences to more than just the area right around the well. Misty.
Sorry, I'm really trying to process that previous slide.
Oh,
So
okay.
if an aquifer collapsed,
Yeah,
would it be fair to say that you can never put that same amount of water back in that same space? And so if that happened, does it just become lost as surface water, or does it bust through somewhere else? Does
cool.
that
Okay,
make
so
sense?
yeah, so the first part of your question makes sense. Like, once an aquifer collapses, and again, we don't see this widespread, but there's instances, an example Greg just gave. So once it collapses, I'm not aware of any way to reinflate it, to pump it back up, right? Like, once that pore space is shrunk in on each other, we're unlikely to create pore space, at least on any meaningful scale. And so, yes, that is a permanent and one direction change. And so what happens to the water is likely going to be dependent on the location in which this happens. Essentially, if you really simplify even more than this block diagram, an aquifer to a pipe, essentially what you're doing is making a smaller diameter pipe. So maybe water moves more quickly through it, and that probably has some consequences. Maybe you just can't, I mean, you aren't going to get as much water through it for the same pressure gradient. And so maybe water level gradients will change from uplands to lowlands.
Okay, so where my thought is going with this, then, would it be fair to say that the state believes that they had a inventory of how much water was available to be allocated, but there isn't statistics to say whether aquifers have collapsed in Oregon? So it's a possibility that we don't know if there is in fact a reduced supply. Is that
Okay,
right?
so I am going to really appreciate your question, because I'm going to redirect it just a little bit to go back to the groundwater as part of the hydrologic cycle. So the amount available to allocate ultimately is the amount of precipitation over the footprint of Oregon. And how that precipitation gets routed to, direct runoff to stream flow versus infiltration to a groundwater system, what we call dynamic storage, as that water moves more slowly through the ground to discharge to surface water, that will alter over time. And with respect to the potential for collapsing aquifers, I have not seen any measurements, and these would be satellite measurements of ground surface that's really precise. You can see, for example, the South Sister volcano, you can see land surface rising and falling on a centimeter scale, and they use this same satellite-based tool to look for ground subsidence from groundwater pumping. To my knowledge, that hasn't been identified in Oregon. So while there might be these local instances, we are not aware that that is a problem at scale for the state.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's such a minor issue, when you look at in the grand scheme of things, we're talking about pretty small local occurrences, and on a regional or statewide basis, they're probably, insignificant.
Greg, please go ahead.
Or Jeff.
I just got up.
Oh, Jeff. Sorry.
Jeff Stone, so granting that hydrological connection between surface and ground.
Yeah.
When we were looking, and strength of stream reach and all those things, you don't wanna lower the reach of any surface water.
Yeah.
What about aquifer recharge?
Okay.
And done on a scale that can be helpful. One of the basic precepts of Bill now 10 years ago, Senate Bill 839, was to look at winter flow, capturing the winter flow that is in excess of what is needed for the base flow, plus helping juveniles and everything, you know, the whole biological scouring out so, so the fish can get through.
Yeah.
And
So-
it also recognizes that with climate change, the stored water through snowpack is reducing.
Mhm.
So I mean, I get all these micro points, but to me, I always like flipping ahead to the end of the chapter to figure out, okay, what problem do we need to solve? And if we're seeing these as true warning signs, then how do you then really put into effect proper recharges that are significant and could then not create, you know, the cones of depression as readily?
Yeah, so.
Did I mix a whole bunch of
You-
crap in there?
You did, but I'm gonna do two things. I'm gonna say storage is definitely of interest. We've heard from a lot of people about storage, and that's, I wanna get into the details of storage in a different venue.
Fair.
I'll say that in this rulemaking, we're only looking at future allocation of what I would call natural supplies. So we have some underground storage processes called aquifer storage and recovery, which is typically point injection and extraction, and aquifer recharge, which can be more broader based infiltration type work. Right now, those water rights associated with that work on a bank, and they exist. Well, ASR exists with existing rights, so you have to have an existing right, and you can, it's a timing shift essentially. So that's not going to be affected by this. And for AR, there is the allocation of new generally surface water to recharge at times when surface water is available. Surface water availability is not going to be impacted by these rules. And so it's a solution, and we can talk about it in solutions, but it's not part of the rule.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I know that I'm overstaying my welcome on this line of questioning. But I just want to make sure that we recognize those aspects.
Yeah.
Because if through the rule making in this process, we in effect create a moratorium on granting any new permits for groundwater. That needs to be done with eyes wide open.
Yeah. So AR and ASR, we desire not to
Yep.
remain.
Comment. Thank you, Jeff.
I just didn't.
Yep.
Okay. So that essentially is the end of the groundwater background. Gonna wrap up by saying, hopefully with that really broad, really general background, it shouldn't come as a surprise, hopefully, to say that we've been allocating groundwater with permit systems since 1955, and that our 65 plus years of allocation has contributed to reduced surface water base flow and groundwater level declines, and those impacts come at the expense of existing users. So new groundwater allocation, again, has a balancing somewhere in the hydrologic cycle, and at times that will impact existing users.
So here is where I was hoping you could get to Adam's question about the criteria behind the groundwater concerns map. And then Greg, I saw that you also had your hand up, and I'm hoping that you can kind of summarize the criteria. And if we did post the groundwater concerns study on the website, so I invite you all to look at it there as well. So maybe if you could speak to Adam's question, and then Greg will go to you.
Okay, so I'm going to speak really broadly to Adam's question. I'm going to hold up this sheet again, just to point out under June 2021, the link for staff report. The staff report to the commission's 5 pages. The attachment is all the details on the groundwater concerns map and how it was created. The goal was to do a data-driven assessment of all of our available groundwater data. So the background to this is that we had taken everything that we had in disparate databases, we put them into one unifying database that spoke with RIS, our water rights information system. And we tried to design queries to assess data in bulk across the state to say, where do we see groundwater level declines from our approximately 1,200 observation wells that we have data for on an annual basis. So if, for example, we identified declines that met a rule definition of excessively declined, which is 50 feet from highest known, then that put it into the bin of significant concern. If we saw water levels that were declining that were halfway there, then that put it into the concern category. If we'd identified, and so there's a suite of those types of analyses that went into these concerns. And, you know, basically anything that we could brainstorm that would allow us to ask a specific question of the database that we could run this again with the same set of codes today and get today's concern answer, and we could adjust those if we needed to. And it includes some things and it doesn't include some things. So it, you know, there are areas where we have flagged that groundwater impacts to state scenic waterways have exceeded the statutory impact of a cumulative total of 1 CFS. That was concerning, and that's why we have big red splotches in the Rogue, the Klamath, the Deschutes. So some of these areas, you know, it was just one controlling thing. If we designed a groundwater critical or limited area, those had concerns associated with them. So the next part that Adam asked was peer review. This was internally peer reviewed, but not externally peer reviewed. Yeah.
Adam Sussman, just a quick follow on, and you'll probably get to this where you're talking about the groundwater concerns being A, impacts to surface water, and B, groundwater levels in and of themselves. And you even mentioned scenic waterways. And I don't know if everyone in this room and online knows that in the Deschutes Basin, that we actually have a mitigation program that's established by rule about how a user of groundwater can mitigate for the impacts to surface water and in fact the scenic waterway. So the fact that that might be lit up from impacts to scenic waterway is probably a little bit misleading. There may be other criteria that are triggered.
Absolutely.
But yeah, but just so that everyone knows, it's the only basin in the state that has a mitigation program established by both statute and rule.
Okay, are you done with this slide?
Yes.
So I want to, Greg, go
Sorry.
ahead, and then I want to check in with folks if people want to have a break or if we want to continue on to the next section, but please ask your question.
Thanks. So this is Greg Phyllis again. I've got a comment and a question. I think my first comment is that, you know, you look at those maps and I think, you know, that it's pretty, it can be a little alarming, you know, you look at these, all these red colors there and especially, you know, when I look at the Willamette Valley area, I have to sort of take that with honestly, a little bit of a grain of salt, because, you know, I'm out there, or my company is out there every March doing water level measurements for, I think we do easily over 100 water level measurements throughout the Willamette Valley. And, you know, very few of them, I see them, you know, continually dropping year to year. And in fact, this year I was a little surprised, you know, we had a few basalt wells that seem to have been kind of declining over the last several years, and they're up in some cases a few feet because we had such a wet year last year. And then I expect that the measurements we get next March maybe will be even, you know, back up even more. So, I mean, just based on my own sort of boots on the ground experience, you know, leads me to be a bit skeptical about at least the just sort of the visual impact that's given by that map. And then I got a question about the reduced surface water base flow. I mean, it certainly makes sense logically, that if we keep pumping groundwater, we're gonna have an effect on those base flows. But I noticed, I look at the data, I have to, when I'm looking at a possible groundwater application, I gotta look at the WAB analyses, water, availability basin analyses that are based on, the department's surface water models and so forth. And I don't see those numbers changing, I don't think I see them changing over the course of many, many years. And so, I'm just curious about why is that? If we're actually seeing reduced surface water base flow, well, why isn't that being reflected in the models?
Yeah, okay. So I'll just say that the water availability reporting system is a static model based on a 30-year period of record, and I don't know what the years are off the top of my head. I'm not sure.
1958 to 1987.
There you go. So it's not changing because that's the period, and we've talked about updating it, and yeah, plans are afoot. So so that's the easy answer, I guess. On the concerns map, I want to both expand on your point and give a counterpoint. So absolutely, for visualization's sake, we took any 3 events from the particular assessments we did. And if we got 3 in a township, which is 36 square miles, then we colored the whole township. So, a problem in a corner of a township will affect the whole 36 square miles. And if you go back, I'll again point you to the June 2021, the presentation at the bottom, we point out some examples where we have water levels in the Umatilla, where we've also got stacked aquifers, right? So the alluvial material is steady, the salt is declining. We still colored it dark red, even though a well at a different depth would be more concerning than others.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of caveats there, and this is certainly like our best attempt at giving a statewide overview. And to the point about the water levels that you measure, absolutely, water levels go up and down with precipitation. Some are more directly responsive than others, right? And I would suggest that in areas where the water levels have been steady year over year over year, we have, I'm going on the wrong key here, we have depletion dominated supply. And as long as we're capturing a good amount of throughput that's otherwise going to the streams, the water from storage is going to be very little, and that means that the water level decline is going to be very little. So even though water levels aren't falling year on year on year, to me, that indicates that that well is getting water from someplace else, and that someplace else is water that was otherwise going to streams. Now, if that was going to the Willamette, there's still water available in the Willamette. So that's this picture that's small and to the upper right. This shows surface water availability according to an 80% exceedance assessment in August. And so if that groundwater is discharging to the Willamette where there's purple, then there's still water available for allocation, then impacting the Willamette according to our surface water, we aren't going to be impacting a senior user, right? Like nobody's being regulated. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't actually know what the regulation history of the Willamette is, but I assume that it's not too many people are being regulated off their pumps in the Willamette. However, if that's impacting a smaller tributary, then that can then impact senior users that otherwise rely on that tributary and declining base loads with time.
Okay,
All right.
so I want to ask, is this a good time for a break? Okay.
Yes.
We are going to our next part of the agenda is to talk about the current allocation process and the need for the rules. I'd also like to ask, people to really just focus on questions of the presentation rather than sort of positions larger. And so with that, we'll take a break until 10 o'clock. And we'll come back at that point and talk about the the current allocation process and sort of the need for the updated rules. So, thank you. Without mentioning it.
Without mentioning it, but she was.
Okay, thank you all. And I want to apologize to Kelly Warren. I did not see your hand up before we took a break. Kelly, can we go to you for your question or comment? Kelly's still here. Oh, he signed off. I will continue to monitor to see if Kelly Warren rejoins us after the break, and my apologies for not noticing that he had his hand up before we left on break. So with that, we will go on to the next part of the agenda, which is really an overview of the existing allocation process and sort of an identification of the need for updated rules. So back to you, Justin.
Okay, so.
And are you driving?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll drive here. Right, let's make sure that I'll.
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome back. This next set of slides is going to give a similar, very high level, very generalized overview of the current groundwater technical review process. The technical review process that the groundwater section does is just one component of the overall process for intaking an application and processing that through to a final order about the status, whether that goes to permit or not. So we're just talking about, one component of the overall process that includes a whole nother set of folks in the Water Rights Services Division and also input from the Field Services Division. So I just want to make sure I scale correctly the sandbox that we're working in here. And I'm going to, well, two things. So first of all, I'm going to point to this page again. August 2017, we gave a more detailed overview of the full groundwater review process to the commission. So that's available written in the staff report or on YouTube in half an hour for those that are curious or want to learn more. We have prepared two sets of flow charts. They're kind of cheat sheets. So we've got this overall chart, which folks should have gotten in their
Yeah, you got
emails.
two PDFs, one labeled figure 1 and one labeled figure 2. I think that's what we're going over in this section.
That's correct. And so essentially this is our best approach at putting our process in layman's terms in a flow chart that points to is water available or not. There's a blue, well, so I'm also just going to note ahead of time, there's a more detailed sheet here that we're going to get to in the following slides, and that's what we're mostly going to be looking at. But
And that's figure 2.
And that's figure 2, correctly. So overall, again, our proposed rule changes focus on the groundwater technical review. That review looks at 4 specific items that are laid out in statute. We shorthand those to the 4-part test. That's the yellow, green, pink, blue boxes here. And our rule revisions relate to just one of those 4 parts of the test of the public interest presumption, and that is the water is available portion. So figure 2 at the top is the same. Black box is the 4-part test. Row of boxes underneath are the 4 parts, and this breaks out water is available into a bunch of streams of analysis. And again, this is a doing our best to simplify and outline the review that we perform in the groundwater section as part of assessing is water available. So water is available, has two parts. One part is we ask, is the source over appropriated? And the definition for that contains both a groundwater component and a hydraulically connected surface water component. And then we ask a second question on the right-hand stream as you look at it, is a new use within the capacity of the resource. And the rest of these slides are going to follow down this flow chart to the various paths from left to right. So we'll start here. Over appropriated is defined in Division 400 currently as a two-part definition. First part relates to this left-hand stream that says that over appropriated means a condition of water allocation in which the appropriation of groundwater resources by all rights exceeds the average annual recharge over the period of record. So I shorthand this to a water budget assessment. So right now the rules say that we're over appropriated when we have issued rights that exceed our understanding of recharge. So to link up with the first part, what does that mean to folks? If we allocate groundwater that's equal to the amount of recharge, what does that mean for base flow? Means the base flow is zero, right? So right now, I just want to acknowledge that our definition basically says we aren't over appropriated until base flow is zero. Now, yeah.
And
go
you have a
ahead.
question.
Oh, a question.
Two questions, actually.
Okay.
Misty, Karen, and then Robin.
Yes,
Misty, go ahead.
this is Misty Buckley. So am I understanding this correctly that, as you said, it's only saying that it's over allocated when it reaches zero, but it's only reaching zero with allocated water rights? And so that's not taking into account the exempt uses because those are not rights. Am I correct?
So thinking about this, if so, I'm going to say, I don't think that appropriation is actually defined anywhere. So that's kind of something that we generally understand, you know, when you see it. So let's just, for the sake of this question, say that allocation or excuse me, appropriation is writing out a paper water right for this public resource, in which case the answer to your question is yes, that would be true, that that does not take cumulative exempt uses into account. Again, I'll point back to the June 2016, or excuse me, October 2016 commission materials, where we estimate that that is 3% of all water, so not zero. So yes, that does not account for at least our current estimate as of 2016, 3% of groundwater use in the state.
Karen.
Crap. You have too many water geeks on here. That's the problem with this meeting. Everybody has the real water geek questions going on. And so I appreciate your patience with us. This may be something that we take offline. So I'll state my question. Then if you think you'd rather deal with it offline, I'm happy to do that. But I do think that recharge can be a complicated issue, particularly when we've got some pretty serious work going on with things like irrigation modernization, where we're piping canals that really, for a fairly good chunk of the historical versus the geologic or hydrologic record, have been recharging through leakage out of those canals. If we pipe them, we're changing the whole recharge system. So I'm just curious about how that idea of recharge is being dealt with in a fluctuating, not only fluctuating natural system, but fluctuating managed systems. And if this isn't germane to the conversation you're trying to have today, I'd still like an answer, but I can get it offline or something.
Sure, I will broadly touch on that in the next slide. But let's go to Robin first and before I move on.
Sure. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could touch on the types of data that you're using to evaluate the recharge, both in confined and unconfined systems.
Okay, perfect. So, going deeper, so if you haven't recognized it already, the circles on the screen are kind of following our pathways down these various sets of analyses. You're not supposed to be able to read it on the screen. I understand it's small. Hopefully you can pull up the paper beside you if you want to kind of follow along, or at least it gives you a visual of where we're at. So the actual analysis that we do on a review form for a particular any particular application is thus. So first of all, taking the rule at face value is recharge greater than appropriation. So getting to, I think it was Karen's question, how do we know what recharge is? Notoriously difficult to measure directly. So getting to Robin's question, what data do we have available? Well, people estimate recharge by estimating discharge. So discharge is something we can measure. And so we have studies of basins across the state where the amount of water recharging the groundwater system coming in is essentially estimated as the base flow of those basins. So the data we have is actually measuring base flow. So when we say that what the rule says that over appropriation is when we've allocated, equal to recharge, given the data we have to estimate recharge, we're saying we've allocated to discharge. Also, because that is integrating over basin scales, the subsurface variability is such that it's really difficult for us to apply aerial recharge over an entire stream basin to a individual application, because the subsurface is not homogeneous, that recharge is not evenly distributed. It doesn't move at a rate that, in many cases, it makes sense to do that. The chutes may be one example where we can more reasonably look at that, and we know that through the basin studies we've conducted.
Okay, can I interrupt you?
Yep.
Robin, is that a legacy hand? Or a follow-up question? Okay, Phil.
Legacy hand, sorry.
Phil, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, it's more of a comment. Exempt wells have come up a couple of times in the conversation, and Justin notes, I think, in a way to put context around the question of exempt wells, that they're roughly 3% of the overall usage in the state. And I think that exempt wells do need to come up, and I know that we're really high level right now. We're not into solutions, but the significance of exempt wells is kind of situational, I'd say. So if you were talking about, one of the study areas like the Harney Basin, that's been of so much interest and study lately, I think, spending a lot of time on exempt wells, that 3% rule or even less probably applies there. But if you live in an area similar to where I live, where big irrigation wells aren't really what's impacting aquifers around here, it's slow creeping growth and additional land use changes that are getting smaller and smaller parcels, and more domestic wells are being installed, then the significance changes. I mean, if that's all you've got is exempt wells and the aquifer is declining, well, then it's the same issue that we're really talking about, the overarching goal of protecting senior water rights holders and stream flow. I think the significance changes situationally, whether you've got big ag wells in your area or not. So that's the comment.
Yeah, no, thanks, Phil. I'll build on that to acknowledge again the scales of space and time have been really difficult to deal with in trying to create a set of rules. And absolutely, I'm throwing out an estimate that's statewide and I'm aggregating over the whole state, while at the same time I'm saying it's really difficult for us to take, some subset of that basin-wide data and make inferences about an application location. So I want to acknowledge that and keep that in mind, that there's always space and time considerations, especially with groundwater that moves much slower than surface water, right? Like just its movement is just slower by orders of magnitude sometimes. Okay, so this really gets at why we have this cannot be determined box, right? We commonly have checked that for the over appropriation when we say, not necessarily do we have data available, but is the data at an appropriate scale to help us make a determination at the location of this application we're looking at today. And so we, in practice, work with proxies and we say, okay, well, in general, this is saying that, we shouldn't be pumping storage, right? This water budget definition says it's over appropriated if allocation exceeds recharge. So that should roughly balance. And if the dominant source water well is storage, then we're going to see declining water levels year on year on year. And so we look for those declining water levels as a proxy for, are we over appropriated from this aspect of the rule definition? And so again, we've got our data density is variable, right? Like we have much more dense data in more populated areas or historic problem areas than we do throughout the whole state. So there's that tension there, but we are looking for best available data that we have, and we are taking a look at, okay, what are the water level trends doing? And right now, statute says we should maintain reasonably stable water levels that comports with the water budget component here. However, that's not defined. Heretofore, reasonably stable groundwater levels has not been defined. And if you read ahead in your rules, you'll see that that's one of the things that we're addressing. Without that definition, we look to the next best thing we have defined, which is excessively declining or declined water levels. And as we do reviews now, we say, okay, we have a water level trend. If it doesn't meet the definition of excessively declined or declining today, then it's not over appropriated today at the time we're doing this review. And so that's how we're assessing yay or nay on that. Again, in these areas where we might not have data in proximity, we always take a look at the best available information. And as I said way back in August 2017, we always have some amount of information somewhere. And so even without hard data, we could say if we get an application in an area where we don't have any proximal water rights, where we don't have any records of exempt use wells, database isn't perfect on that, but for the most part, we don't have records of exempt use wells, then there's been no appropriation, and therefore we can't be over appropriated because we haven't taken anything out yet. So that might be a case where we mark is not over appropriated. Similarly, getting back to Greg's example, if we don't have data in a particular area, but we know that the rights or exempt use wells that have been installed are near a stream, and we expect the hydrogeologic setting such that capture is the dominant source of water to those wells, we wouldn't expect water levels to decline. We'd say not over appropriated for this part of the definition. Okay, so that's current process of how we look at essentially water level stability today.
Say who you are.
I'm Adam Sussman with GSI. Thanks, Justin. A quick question and then a comments from some of my hydrogeologist
Oh my
friends,
gosh.
because I'm not a hydrogeologist, and I will tell everyone in the room that. So my first question is on excessively declined. I'm curious, I know that that's defined in Division 8. I'm curious when that definition was established and what was the basis, the science behind the 15% and 50 feet in that. And my comment is, and you don't need to respond to this, it's just that some of my colleagues are not necessarily in agreement that water level data is a good proxy for a water budget assessment, because it does not take into account lots of other stressors on the aquifer, like canal lining, proximity to recharge, well construction, on and on.
Yep.
So just comment, but curious about that question.
So I don't know off the top of my head when the rule was put in place. When we go and look at the rule, if we look to the bottom, it has the date, right, of the last modified. So we can look that up and get to it, or do it at the next break.
I think we'll
Go
come
ahead.
back to it.
Come back to it, okay? And as far as the basis, I really don't know that. I suspect the rule was 80s, 90s era. So I'm not sure what the
We're gonna go over Division 8, so we'll incorporate, we'll research your question and see if we can incorporate an answer in our presentation when we go over Division 8, Adam.
And you could add to my question, do those numbers make sense everywhere in the state?
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, and lastly, I don't disagree that water level trends are not a perfect proxy for water budget. And I'll expand that and say, nor do I think that the water budget is the appropriate unit of assessment. And we have proposed to change that in the new rules. So we'll address that, and maybe it would be most productive to talk about what it should be. And we'll have that discussion in the Division 8 section. So, all right. Second part of the definition, let's see, is here. Over appropriated means a condition of allocation that results in the further depletion of already over appropriated surface waters. So you'll see the indicator of where the stream is on the flow chart there. And essentially, this is what we would term our Division 9 assessment for the potential for substantial interference of a groundwater use with surface water. PSI rules go through a number of steps. I'm gonna really simplify it here. Is there hydraulic connection, right? If there's a ephemeral stream, and I can't remember who asked the question, but it was Laura, there was the Vado zone in between. That if that stream is what we would call perched above the water table, if that water table does not connect, there's not a saturated flow path, then that water table can go up and down without affecting how much is seeping through that Vado zone. So that's no hydraulic connection, pumping impacts aren't going to propagate to impact that stream. So that kind of takes it off the table. But if there is hydraulic connection, then we go through a series of prescriptive assessments to determine, that are found in this definition of potential for substantial interference. These are things like distance of the well to the stream. If it's a quarter mile or less and hydraulically connected, then PSI. If you're within a mile hydraulically connected, your pumping rate is greater than 1% of a in-stream flow, or 80% exceedance flow, natural stream flow, then PSI. If your pumping impact is, on that curve of stream flow depletion, if you get up to 25% of the pumping rate after 30 days of pumping, then PSI. That's in a nutshell the assessments we go through, and that was quick. And I'm going to leave it there until we get to Division 9 and the rule changes, and we can talk more about what it was, but more importantly, what we're proposing it be. So with that, I'm going to skip now to the last stream in is water available, and that is, would a proposed use be within the capacity of the resource? That definition is also in Division 400. Those are rules of the commission, or policies of the commission. And it's defined there as the ability of a groundwater resource to sustain a balance of uses without causing overappropriation, or without otherwise significantly impairing the function or character of the resource. And our current assessment then goes through these major questions. And actually, because I said causing overappropriation, I'm gonna skip to the second bullet here. If a request comes in that is for a rate that we don't believe that the aquifer can yield. So we had the example of Yamhill wells in fractured marine sediments that typically do 10-15 GPM. If we saw 1 CFS, which is roughly 450 GPM application there, we would say, hey, if you were, from an engineering perspective, able to get that out of this aquifer, you would definitely draw down water levels to a point where reasonably or the excessively declined is likely to be tripped or what have you. So we try and catch if somebody has applied for a rate that's not expected to be available from the aquifer. And then in the function or character of the resource, we try and be forward-looking with that. Well, and maybe I should touch on permit decline conditions first. We've interpreted the function or character as being the ability of the aquifer to, maintain these uses. And so if we have issued existing water rights that would be senior to this new application, and that water right permit had conditions related to groundwater level declines, if those are tripped and therefore that water right user should use less water or no water until the water levels come back up, then we interpret that as having affected the function and character, and adding a new use to that isn't going to be advisable. We're just going to create more conflict. So that goes into capacity of the resource. And then lastly, we look at long-term water level trends. So I had said in the way we evaluate over appropriation for groundwater, the way that the rules are set up in the definitions, we look to excessively declined definition. And has that been met today, or is it appropriated? Is it over appropriated right now as we're reviewing this application? However, if we see a trend that hasn't met that definition, but is headed in that direction, and in our best hydrogeologic judgment, we know that we're headed to tripping that condition with the current state of allocation, we've marked capacity of the resource because we don't want to keep adding on and hasten our decline there. Because once we do that, that trips our, commission should take action to rectify that, right? So that's a critical groundwater area or something else. So we don't want to add junior users to a system that we foresee we're going to have to curtail back in the future, because then we're saying you should invest, and then we're going to pull that water back, and that doesn't help anybody. So go ahead, Susan. Yeah.
Is there a time frame on that perspective look?
There is not a written down time frame, and that is at this point discretion of the hydrogeologist, and it depends somewhat honestly on the water level record we have for the area, right? So the data has to show that. That's one place where, yeah, we have to have data to show that that's happening to meet our standard of proof in all of these assessments is preponderance of the evidence, which can be put into layman's terms of more likely than not, or semi-quantitative. We have to look at all the evidence available to us, and if we're 51% confident one way or the other, that's the burden of proof for making findings on all these boxes. So okay, and that is the end of this section. I kind of foreshadowed this, but in our need for updated rules, again, we've found that we really need to define reasonably stable groundwater levels, and we've taken a stab at that, and also that in order to be true to the definition of overappropriation that says further impact to already overappropriated surface waters, right now, Division 9 protects against short-term acute impacts, but allows for longer-term impacts, year-on-year impacts, cumulative impacts, and we don't think that in a prior appropriation system, a water right in 2023 is that we know is going to impact the stream that is already being curtailed back, such that users with water rights in the 1900s or maybe even 1800s are getting curtailed back too. So we don't want to further ding those streams where the senior users are already being curtailed back. So that is our focus going forward, and that's the end of that section. So
I do not see any questions from RAC members who have joined us virtually.
Okay.
So if you would like to continue with sort of an overview, since we already did our break, an overview of the approach, let's do that.
all right. Okay, so I teased I was going to come back to this reminder So again, when we looked at the rules and assessed where we believed improvements could be made, the improvements are defined as updating the groundwater rules to be more sustainable over the long term and more protective of existing water right holders, both in stream and out of stream. So that's when I go through an overview of the broad brush strokes of the changes that we've drafted up. That's the overlying umbrella under which we made the draft changes. So a word about the framework. So again, I put figure 1 up here of our current process. We are addressing rules that are related to water is available, is water available. So that part of the 4-part test. And we want to, of course, base our rules in law, right? Like our authority lies in statute. So anything that we do in these rules has to be supported by statute. Also want to base it in science. We want to take into account the source of water to wells and the fact that groundwater is part of the hydrologic cycle, and make sure that our rules are true to the actual physical system. And that necessitates generalizations. I'll say that again and often, but we want to, as much as possible, based in science. We wanted to focus on groundwater allocation and specifically, again, this availability without affecting other rules. So I'll have a slide specific to that. It does not include ASR, but that's a good point that Jeff made earlier, that we'll lump that in. And we want to be as clear and concise as we can be. So we strive to put things in terms that were that were clear and understandable, and that we could come to agreement on what they mean. So I've got a slide for each of these 4 bullet points, at least a slide. Again, basis in law, really, it's the overall Groundwater Act of 1955, but these 2 statutes are really kind of fundamental. So we've got a 4-part test in 537621, and again, only looking at one part of that 4-part test, the water is available part. And again, making sure that we reiterate that we want a positive finding that water is available to apply that precautionary principle that's come up in a lot of discussions with the commission. And ORS 537780 is a section that talks about the powers of the commission, and in there it has a specific section that to make a determination that groundwater use will impair or interfere with surface water, it must be based on substantial evidence. So we wanted to make sure that we were designing the rules that such that we were doing an analysis that would result in substantial evidence of that potential impact. Go ahead, Susan.
Susan Smith again. Why the second prong and not the third prong?
The injury?
Yes.
Okay, so mostly as I would say a practical matter in a sense of scale, like these are really substantial changes, and that is a whole nother section of substantial change. So maybe in the future.
I did want, before we move off of here, just alert folks, if you want to look up the statutory language, we have links to both rules and statutes on our rulemaking website. If you go into that first, I don't know what you call it, box that says rule information and background, there are some of the references we're alluding to, as well as statute and rule language. You can click in there and you know, if you want to pull the exact language, you can look for it in there. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll come back to these statutes again. Just want to again set the authority piece. So basis in science, again, this gets back to the first part of our this gets back to our groundwater intro. Again, source of water dwells from storage or capture. and also the timing of that impact as laid out by Tice in 1940 originally, and then the timing, that Tice has been, continues to be built on, and a big USGS summary of stream flow depletion by wells in 2012. So similar to what Laura just said, those documents are on the website. You can go look at the originals and take a look at the details, and we might come back to those. That's where most of the figures have come from that I presented earlier.
Kelly, thank you for rejoining us. My apologies for not seeing that your hand was up before we took our break. I'm hoping you could remember your question or comment and contribute it at this time.
I'm going to decline, but I'm going to monitor.
Okay, thank you. And again, my apologies. I just did not see your hand.
Okay, so putting this together, this nexus of law and science, when we again have these major overarching changes, when we define reasonably stable groundwaters or groundwater levels, we're trying to get at addressing groundwater appropriation from storage. And when we redefine potential for substantial interference, we're doing our best to address the impacts of groundwater appropriation from capture, specifically from stream flow depletion. So that's how those things link up, at least in our minds. Additional constraints. So again, we wanted to retain as is all the other operations of the department. So we didn't want to we were really focused on not having unintended consequences. And as you could see in, for example, the definition of capacity of the resource, it was surface water and groundwater, right? Like are in the same sentence, and that's common in the way that the rules are written. So we've done our best to try not to affect surface water allocation. Specifically, we didn't want to affect the Deschutes Basin groundwater mitigation rules that Adam mentioned earlier in the meeting. We also didn't want to impact the Division 33 rules for public interest presumption or public interest considerations with regard to sensitive, threatened, or endangered fish species.
And
Yeah.
there's a question in the chat. Casey, would you like to verbalize your question or would you like me to read it?
I just wanted to confirm that the best science that's being employed in this process is on the well issue is from 1940, and there's nothing more recent that corroborates that science.
So 1940 was the original basis, and that was really, well, I shouldn't say that was really. That is a widely cited person, Mr. Tice there, who really laid the foundation of quantitative hydrogeology. And I will confirm that I hope I said that was kind of the beginning. And I just want to note that it started in 1940. So it's been out there for a long time. It has been built on, significantly. For example, Tice didn't talk about timing at all. So again, this 2012 document by Barlow and Leak, both these folks are USGS scientists. That Barlow and Leak document is 100 plus pages, and it really pulls together much of the important literature from 1940 through, that point in 2012, including, modern computer modeling techniques and other things. So I don't want to diminish Tice because it's really important. And yes, it has absolutely been built on, and we are using best available modern understanding.
Thank you very much, Justin. Appreciate that.
Sure thing.
Jeff Stone, so as we're talking about Division 33 and we're talking about public interest, I just want to put a flag in that there are other circumstances that are impacting permitting in Division 33 that at some point in the future, I'd like to have us address as a group.
Okay.
So I think I heard your comment to be that you think the department should prioritize a review of Division 33 in its rulemaking process. It will not be part of this effort.
Not part of this effort. But when we actually are talking about groundwater permitting, I just think that it's important for us to recognize that there are significant other factors, other agencies that are making that more difficult.
Okay, thank you for that comment.
That's right.
Well, very polite.
Okay, so lastly, again, general approach. So, and I ask that all the RAC members help me out with this, right? If we have not been clear in something, if our wording could be better, by all means, as we get into the actual line by line edits and in red line strike through, please help us out and make sure that we have as clear language as possible. Our goal was to, edit surgically is the I don't know, flippant way of saying it. We wanted to achieve the objective with as few changes to the rules as possible. So we wanted to try to make sure that we could focus our effort and your attention and the state's attention on as few changes as possible as opposed to changing all over the place. To help us do that, we tried to edit at the highest tier of dependent rules. So you're going to see that from statute to a set of rules, define something in statute, and then there's another division that defines something there, and then there's a third division that defines something there. And so there's these linked dependencies, and we tried our best to edit at the highest tier so that it would flow down. Found that to be difficult over time. And then remove redundancy, and kind of same story. We wanted to, I actually think we succeeded that the rules are, as proposed, shorter than they started. So I take that as a point of pride, but also the statutes that have been built on over the years are redundant in and of themselves. And so it was hard to remove all the redundancy when your authority has multiple terms that are self-referential. So did our best to try and tease all that out and make it as clear as possible. So again, please help us out with that as we look through the red line. So quick reminder that we're starting with the statute, and the next set of slides are just going to be a real broad overview of the 5 divisions that we've proposed edits to. First slide is just pointing out what the divisions are. So under this 537-621, which is the statute for review of an application for a permit to acquire any water right, and specifically water is available, that water is available is first defined in division 300. Those are the definitions for water right application processing rules for the 300 series of divisions. That calls out capacity of the resource and over appropriation. Those definitions are found in division 400, which are another set of definitions for statewide water resources management and commission policy in 410. There's some terms in there that are themselves defined in division 8. Division 8 is titled definitions of statutory groundwater terms. So anytime, like, even though that's the 3rd tier down, anything that was a term in statute, we didn't want to pull up, because this is the division where people go as they're reading through the statute to see, okay, what is an aquifer, for example. So we've edited all 3 of those divisions under this review of an application, and specifically, so 621 is the 4-part test, and I've said over and over, just water is available, just one part of that 4-part test. Division 300 defines water available, and the new definition says it is that groundwater is not over appropriated and within the capacity. Over appropriated and within the capacity are again defined in division 400, and there's components of those definitions that are themselves in division 8. So that's the flow down, and we're going to, as a group here in the RAC, we've organized our discussion so that it follows this progression. So we aren't taking them in order 8, 9, 300, 4, 410. We're taking them in dependency order of 300 first, then 400, then 8, and we'll go so down to division 9.
Susan.
Oh,
Yeah, Susan Smith. One of the things that strikes me is that we're trying to conjunctively manage the groundwater and the surface water. Have you all considered how the changes that you're proposing might change applications for surface water?
It's a good question. We have considered how surface water availability should take into account groundwater appropriation. Right now, it partially does that. It debits the system for rights that are found to have PSI, but water is still available. So in the previous example of a well near the Willamette River, if we issue that right, because even though there might be PSI, there's water available there, so we would debit that water available there. So that's the current status of things, and so I'll leave it at that. Because we're looking here in these changes at future groundwater allocation, I'm not coming up with a quick idea of how that might affect future surface water allocation. So I'm not, but we're changing definitions. So maybe backward looking, or when WARS becomes updated sometime in the future to be a 30-year period that reflects our more modern climatic reality, then that could play.
I'll follow up on that later.
Okay. Okay, so getting to that conjunctive use, we've really focused in these rule rewrites on, again, this statute about the powers of the commission and the specific requirements that the commission has to meet in order to find impact or interference to surface water bodies. We've edited 2 divisions, 410 and 9. 410, again, sorry, is the statewide water resource management rules. That's commission policy essentially. And division 9, again, is our groundwater interference with surface water divisions. And so within those 2, in division 410, we have a real light touch. We just want to reiterate affirmatively that groundwater allocation going forward under these proposed new rules would require a positive finding that water is available. And in division 9, we had a much bigger rewrite that I'll broadly frame as aligning the assessment of PSI with the definition of overappropriation and the prior appropriation doctrine. And once we get into that and talk about the details, I'm sure there'll be a lot of back and forth, and especially bringing in the scale issues. So with that, that's the overall overview of where we're headed.
Okay, I want to pause there for a minute and ask, do people need another or want another break? People in the room are shaking their heads no. Is there any? The thing, so for the individuals in the room, there was a question in the chat about whether. Hold on. Whether we had a website, whether the department has a web page that provides information about the water resources available relative to water rights that have been allocated. And the person in the chat, this is Deb Merchant, said she's attempting to determine if Oregon's water right permits exceed or not the actual water available to meet those permitted rights. For surface water, we do have the water availability reporting system, and Zach did put a link to the water availability reporting system in the chat. I just want to acknowledge that, as we touched on a couple times here already, has a base period from 1958 to 1987. So there are some limitations in the water availability reporting system. There is an investment that the legislature is currently looking at for that system that will hopefully bring that period of record up to more current, but that is the only place where we currently have that type of information. We don't have anything similar to that for groundwater. So I think that brings the people in the room up to discussion. with that happened in the chat. So is there anybody, if there's, oh, Misty, you've got a question, please go ahead.
Real quick. So to clarify, do you mean the data doesn't exist at all, or it's just not published on the website?
So where we have the data for groundwater is in specific basin studies. So that is, and those basin studies are available on our website. So we don't have it on a statewide scale, but we do have it in the basins of Klamath, Deschutes, Willamette, Harney, and we're currently working on the Walla Walla. So we don't have anything that is a statewide look. Okay, I think, why don't we move on and cover Division 300? Since nobody here is itching for a break. And I do want to just remind and acknowledge that we are going to have public comment promptly at 11:30. So we'll start with Division 300, and depending on the questions and comments, we'll move on to Division 400 if we have time.
Okay. So a little more detailed overview specifically of Division 300.
You may want to pause just for a
Okay,
second. So
yeah.
you all did receive a PDF version of the track changes for Division 300. But we provided the rule references here so you can kind of follow along that way as well.
So we did two general things. We focused in on this definition under number 57 for water is available again. And again, we wanted to set surface water and groundwater apart. So we started with definitions that had surface water and groundwater in the same section, if not sentence. We set the existing definitions in sub A through sub C for surface water only, and then pull the groundwater down into a new B and define groundwater as it's not over appropriated currently today, right now, as we look at it, and it's available within the capacity of the resource looking forward to the best of our ability. Those are both defined in Division 400, so we'll get to the specific divisions next, but for right now, this is what the changes look like. And so, Laura, I'm gonna ask you to help me out because I'm not sure how much. I'm not sure what the back and forth looks like at this stage of our RAC process.
I mean, we're putting the proposed changes up. Why don't you click through the rest of the section,
Okay.
and then we'll ask for comments on the rule language as it's drafted.
Okay, perfect. So,
And I'd assume there'd be an opportunity to follow up with additional input. not-
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Make sure.
Yeah. Now or forever hold your peace.
So,
For folks online, there was a question on whether or not this was the only opportunity to provide input on this language, and it is not.
yeah, and so again, in A through C here, we specifically, it talked about source, right? It talked about water is available as a source that was all inclusive. So we broke it out, said specifically, these will stick for surface water sources. And then we added a D at the bottom where we simply said the requested groundwater source, again, is not currently over appropriated under the definition in 400. And it's available within the capacity of the resource under the definition in Division 400. So that, yeah, the meat's in the next division, but this sets up the, what is water available? Water is available when we see that in statute.
Why don't we move on to Division 400, since that's where the meat is?
Okay, so any comments, questions on this?
We can flip back to this if it's gonna make more sense to go through, take a look at the definition of 400 and come back.
Yeah. All right, so, okay, perfect. So we'll move on to Division 400. Again, I'll have these kind of overview big picture tables, and then we'll go to the specific language. So what we did in 400 was we altered the definitions in sub 4 for capacity of the resource, as well as sub 11 for over appropriation. So we'll tackle capacity of the resource first. And again, the changes we made were intended to, first of all, align the language with the policy in 410 with respect to the definition of over appropriation. And we changed a term from any particular water right will cause over appropriation to any particular water right will contribute to recognize the cumulative impacts of all groundwater appropriations heretofore on any particular piece of the hydrologic cycle. And then we specifically called out function or character to give a definition that was heretofore undefined. So it was kind of over the years, how the groundwater section internal process evolved is kind of how it is now, what I presented earlier. And we've specifically lined out what does function or character mean.
That number, can you just go back for a second? So that 537.5259, that should have an ORS in front of it. It's a statutory reference. Catching that.
So is this?
Go ahead,
Jeff Stone.
Yeah.
So this is to establish a baseline in which you can tell if it's over appropriated. So
Correct.
you have the surface side, but then you have every well.
Yeah.
So the question is, at what point in time is it all wells? And back when I had hair in the Lincoln administration, or is it just with the availability in the current wells that are active?
So
Can we look at the language and then
Yeah.
maybe come back to your question?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what posed my question, my brain, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
So I understood your question to be, what time frame are we looking at in making the assessment of whether or not the resource is over appropriated?
Right.
okay, so here I can get it's okay. So here's this changing. So existing, anytime you see a strike through, that's existing language that we've taken out. Anything in red is new language that we put in. Should have mentioned that last couple slides. So we've taken this definition that we revisited earlier in the meeting, and we've said, we're not going to look at any particular well causing over appropriation. That's honestly probably pretty unlikely, but we're going to look at the cumulative impacts. And to get to your point, Jeff, I think in practice, we would look at all valid water rights. So parallel track, a lot of conversation about measurement reporting, knowing what's being used. We know that not all water rights are used to their full extent in all years. And in general, I think that it's fair to say that nobody wants to forfeit their right. And so everybody's going to do their best to use their water right at least to the minimum. And therefore, every water right that's not canceled could legally be pumped at any point in time. And so we would look at, from my perspective in implementing this, that would be all valid water rights, the duty of all valid water rights.
Does that answer your question?
To some degree, because I look at its impact not only now, but in the future, right? So,
yeah.
When how long is long enough?
Yeah.
In the future for this application not to get hung up. So I'm just trying to figure out, how long is long enough?
Yeah.
And I don't have a policy point to make here, but I just for my own sake of trying to understand the rule better, that's just a question.
So this is, I think, most related to the impacts of groundwater pumping on surface water. And we will definitely talk about that when we get into the Division 9 changes and how, like, we discussed a lot about how far into the future to look at those impacts, and we'll come back to that if you can hold on. for-
100%.
meetings.
What
So,
Jeff said again, 100%, but when we get to that point, when we look at wells.
Yeah.
You know, how deep is deep enough? You know, do you count that there's gonna be bleed out from a well in its construction?
okay,
Because that would add impact as well. So I would just add that when we get there.
okay.
Okay, and then. Laptops. I don't know what happened there. Is everybody? It's I'm muted here. It's not me. Can people hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. Forgot what I was gonna say. Oh, there is a person in the chat. Still learning people's names. Last name McClellan, you had a question that I'd like you to verbalize, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to hear staff expand a little bit on how they would use the impend aspect of this rule. Time frame, or what's the judgment call there they would envision using?
So Justin, did you hear the question?
I did not, I'm sorry. Could
Okay,
you
the
repeat
question is, how would you use the aspect of impend in the rule?
Okay, so,
Can you show me where it is? I'm not sure I'm tracking the
it's
question.
here at the base.
Okay,
That's
at the
correct.
bottom, exist
Yeah.
or impend. Thank you.
So, sorry, we're getting
Can
our.
we pause just for a second, please? Can you make sure you're not sharing?
I'm not sharing.
Because something got messed up.
So it looks like she's viewing your screen, so.
I
that's-
actually.
Okay.
Can you turn this off?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's a difference when you touch it, but.
I'm not-
All right.
Sorry, folks, we're getting the screen back up in the room with black there. But maybe if folks have, I think everybody in the room might have their sheets open or can look over the shoulder at their neighbor. So the question was about exist or impend. So
This needs to get.
where does that occur? So it occurs at the bottom of 4, right above A, B, and C. And that's a good question that we, let me take a step back.
So hold on,
Yeah.
let's all get on the same page. Can people still hear us?
Yes,
We are
we can
on-
hear you. We can hear you just fine.
Okay, we are on page 50, we're all looking at page 54 in the presentation. So for anybody who doesn't have a copy in the room here of the presentation we're going through, we're on page 54. And I'm hoping that folks online are able to get to that same page as well.
Yeah, and I think we're actually still here because you're viewing Laura's screen, so I think this is what folks are.
And can folks online actually, okay, so you are able to see the screen. Okay, beautiful. We just had some audio problems. And the question is around the language at the bottom of 4 that says exist or impend.
To be clear, I understand what exist means. It's just impend.
I think it's a great question, Casey.
Yeah, okay, it looks like we've fallen out of presenter view real quick. I just want to see.
Why don't you go ahead and answer the question, Justin?
Yeah.
And Laura's getting us our IT folks. So
Okay,
Let's talk about the question.
Oh my gosh. There we go. Okay. All right, so first of all, I just want to wrap a bow on causes or contributing to, again, want to look at cumulative impacts, make sure that we take into account the impacts of all past allocations, because impacts are cumulative, right? So any impact of tomorrow's allocation is going to be on top of what's happened since 1955. Moving down, we looked to define function or character. So again, we wanted to take that out of the kind of internal policy where it's built over time and make that explicit. And so we did that with A through C, and the way we came up with those A through C is by looking back at the statute. So we looked at the policy of the legislature, specifically 537.5259. And that says if, and then gives a laundry list of 8 things, and we picked out 3 of them here. If those things exist or intend, then the commission shall seek a voluntary agreement among the users of the resource. And if that fails or doesn't come to fruition, the language is the old school language. The commission shall use the police powers of the state, right? So the reason we have exist or impend in here is because that's the language in the statute. And if groundwater levels are not reasonably stable now, existing, or if we feel that it's impending that they're not reasonably stable, that could be a capacity of the resource issue, right? So historic graph that a linear sense, we haven't currently met any of the specific definitions of excessively declined, but it's pretty apparent that that's going to continue for 20 years and we will get to excessively declined in 20 years time. And so we have said not within the capacity of the resource to issue more on top of that, because that's just going to get us there quicker. And once we get there, then the statute says seek voluntary agreement between the parties, or as far as the state modern day is create a critical groundwater area and curtail back to junior users. So we don't want to add junior users that we're then going to in the future curtail back, right? We don't want to. Yeah.
So the term impend is the forward-looking analysis.
Yep, thank you.
Does that answer your question, Casey?
Yeah, is there a limit to that time frame? I mean, if you say it's going to impend, does impend reach out a decade? Is it a year? Is it 20 years?
Great question.
Yep. So right now there is not a defined time limit for impend. We haven't attempted to do that, and so the short answer is no. It's, I think right now would fall into the professional judgment of the hydrogeologist doing the review and any back and forth that goes on with the agent of the applicant.
Okay, couple comments in the room here. Susan and then Bill, did you have a comment?
Yeah.
Okay, Susan.
Susan Smith, my comment is this. It's a little back, but we talked about the fact that we're looking at over appropriation, given all valid water rights, which would be paper rights, is what I think have to be.
Yes.
And the exercise of those paper rights is going to be substantially less in those instances than the size of the paper right. In going ahead and calculating that groundwater pumping is going ahead and taking out available flow to the surface, you're going to overestimate the impacts by relying on paper rights as opposed to actually exercising rights. And it seems like to me, in terms of the science basis of the rule, you're going to have to in some way quantify the extent to which you're overestimating the impact.
Okay, I want to pause for just a minute. I got a request to paraphrase your comment. So I want to make sure people are still able to hear me. Our IT folks fixed whatever was happening.
Down the right slide.
We are still on the right
Okay.
slide, thank you. Okay, so Professor Smith, I am gonna paraphrase, and if I inaccurately paraphrase, please correct me. I think what I heard you say is that based on the discussion we had around over appropriation and the fact that the department looks at all water rights in making that evaluation, we are going to be overestimating because not all water rights are fully exercised all the time. Did I paraphrase you accurately?
Correct.
Okay,
Very good. Okay,
Bill and then Adam.
oh, can I add to that or have a partial response anyway? So you are correct. By assuming that all water rights are being pumped, we would overestimate impacts. And all those water rights can be pumped. And in a prior appropriation system where it is rare that a water right becomes forfeit and comes off the books, adding more users to the junior side of the ledger that are presumably going to use wet water because it's a new use and they're going to develop it out and use it, adds impacts that leaves, maybe I'll call them sleeper impacts, hanging out there. And so we have examples where we have over allocated the system. So I'll go to one of my favorite examples of the Harney Basin in the Weaver Springs area. We have absolutely over allocated it. Water levels have dropped 100 feet in the last 10 plus years. Okay, too much use. And currently unused rights that are still valid rights are currently in the transfer queue to drop a senior user into that area. And so in thinking about what is the best way, again, our overall goal to be sustainable and protective of existing users. Yes, we are over appropriating. We are taking, I would argue, a forward look at what can happen with the existing authorizations that have already been developed. And so that is why I would do that.
Okay, I want to make sure we hear from all of the RAC members, so I'm gonna resist the urge.
Yeah.
I make sure that we do hear, Bill and then Adam, and I don't currently see any hands up, virtually. Go ahead, Bill.
Right, so Bill Jager, I am looking at this paragraph 4 and the focus and what has been said about the meaning of the word intend. I'm having a little trouble, which I think is a period of time, but not some period of time, but not a infinity or not a limited period of time. I'm having trouble figuring out how to reconcile that with the beginning of the paragraph that has the word sustain. To me, sustain tends to refer to a more unlimited future period of time. And so is there a conflict or contradiction between using the word sustain and then using the word intent?
I don't know. Is that something you want to respond to? Or is that
I
something
wanna
that we
flag
need
that.
to consider?
Yeah, okay,
Come back
that's
to it.
fair, yeah.
Okay.
Yep,
Adam,
Yeah, Adam Sussman, GSI Water Solutions on behalf of Cocoa. I just want to pile on, I guess, on the word intend. Rulemaking, one of the reasons for doing rulemaking is to clarify what's in statute. So if you just take a word that's in statute, and put it in the rule, and no one knows what it means, we haven't really provided any value, right? Number one. And so I really want to think about that. And I do a lot of work in the Deschutes Basin where there are cycles of lots of precipitation and drought, and water levels go up and down over long periods of time. The water levels that we're seeing today, we've seen these kinds of declines in the 30s. And then they came back to very high levels in the 80s. So I'm concerned about the statement that, well, we'll just leave this to the discretion of the reviewer, because I'm not sure that that's a good path forward.
Okay.
Okay.
Understood. I would like to say, I'd like to add on, because I think this is going to come up again and again. We are going to definitely need to have a robust conversation about flexibility and not, because I hear you that you don't think it's good to leave it up to the discretion of the reviewer and that value add. I agree with the value add part. And the discretion of the reviewer is one person, right? Like that's a person that we hire that's skilled and qualified and has spent a lot of time looking at an area, and others have too. Folks that work in areas, right? So together, hopefully we can build that record. And once we write down a number, there is no longer discretion. And I would add that I want to put words into your mouth, but I have heard from advocates of water right holders, come on, that rule is arbitrary. That rule sets the line. I'm right on this side of it. I need to be on that side. Where is our flexibility? So I want to acknowledge both sides and just make sure that we take both into account.
Okay.
Follow on. I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting for a number. I'm just saying we should think about what that means.
Yeah, so we have, I want to finish with the RAC comments on this particular section. We have one more section in division 400, and we have public comment at 11:30. I'm not sure we're going to have time for a break, so if somebody needs a break, just go ahead and self-break. Jeff?
Nope.
No comment?
Nope, your look was enough. Be quiet.
That was not
Compliant.
intended to,
Compliant.
that was not intended to,
I did wanna
dissuade
talk to you
input
after
from the
we're done.
RAC. You're here to provide us input, so that's the most important part that I want to make sure we get.
I just want to know then, yes, Jack Stone, does flexibility include, you know, when we as a nursery industry, we become more and more efficient about how we use it. We use recycling ponds and all that. And so we have to show that we are able to use our full right.
Yeah.
At some point. When you talk about flexibility, are you talking about that aspect of flexibility? Or is it like what we're trying to pass, which may have passed today out of the Senate, that's releasing, that you can have a arrangement with fish, but it doesn't really impact doesn't create a forfeiture situation. So I'm just trying to ask that because it will help me understand better.
No, I'm just trying to
Can we-
I'm just trying to
I'm
bring.
sorry, can we pause for a second? I want to make sure, can people online, are they following what we're saying?
Are you able to hear, since we lost the room video?
It's also.
Yes, we're able to hear. Yep,
Okay.
loud and clear.
Okay. I wasn't trying to speak of any particular thing. I just wanted to flag, because I know that this is going to come up, that like we thought, like there's a tension, right, between you know, hard lines and the ability to discuss, and that's tough. It's just tough. Like I understand both viewpoints, right, and it'll play into one person's favor, not another person. So like it's gonna be hard to. We're gonna have to do the best we can.
So I'm gonna see if I can share my screen.
No, please don't do that.
If you stop sharing, we can pull it up.
We see the screen. The
They're
screen is
fine.
being
They see
shared.
the-
We just don't see the room owl video, but the screen is
Okay,
being.
thank you for clarifying that. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, let's move on then to, are there any other comments on this section, section 4 on the definitions? I think we've heard a lot of feedback on the use of the word impend. And we will do some more thinking about that in light of the feedback. Any other feedback on this section? Okay, let's move on then to the next section, please.
Okay, so definition of over appropriation. The rule revisions again are intended to make this definition more in line with our best understanding of the source of water to wells, which is a mixture that changes over time of capture and storage. So it takes an existing two-part definition and changes that. So next slide. First thing we did, and again, to kind of just in the editing process to try and make things clean, we kind of switched the order A, B, E, A, same thing as an or statement. So I'll start with what we crossed out. We crossed out what I've shorthanded as the water budget approach. So over appropriated means a condition of allocation in which surface water, we separated out itself, groundwater source, and then skip down to C. And we just put in groundwater levels are not reasonably stable as defined in division 8. That's a next division we'll get to. So the definition of reasonably stable will be we'll take a lot of input on. So and up top, we basically just clarified the capture portion of the source of water to wells and said that groundwater sources hydraulically connected to an already over appropriated surface water source as per the definition in division 9. So we took that definition that was less clear perhaps and made it specific to a definition that will have specific rules associated with it.
And we should come back to this slide after we've gone through division 8, where we will define reasonably stable. That will be on the agenda for our next meeting. And then also after we've come back to, we've covered division 9, so you can see how it all fits together. So I'm not sure who raised their hand first, but I will call on Sarah first, please.
Hi, thank you. Subsection B to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it looks like you're saying that a groundwater source is always over appropriated if it's hydraulically connected to an over appropriated surface water source. And I think that's making a really gross generalization about hydrogeologic principles and whether the recharge in a groundwater source can support perhaps over appropriated surface water source. And so I think you're making a really broad scientific finding here and broad category for groundwater sources where they're always going to be over appropriated.
Okay, thank you for that comment. We'll go to Zach and then Greg.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious. I'd like to hear Justin's perspective. I agree with the additions here, including the hydraulic connection to over-appropriated surface water, which follows Barlow and Leake's paper. But I'm curious, why not also include the crossed out section? So in other words, instead of just adding the hydraulic connection and the reasonably stable, why not add those two and keep the or statement of the overall recharge exceeding or overall recharge being exceeded by the overall demand? Why remove that?
Go ahead, Justin.
Okay, so one of the goals that we talked about with the commission was being able to make a positive finding and aligning the rules so that cannot be determined, could be left off as an option. And the water budget approach has historically led to a lot of cannot be determined because just at the scale of the information we have, its applicability to a specific location. And again, this is the mismatch between scale of the data is basin wide or even sub basin wide. the scale of the application is very localized and the subsurface variability is, the impacts from a well in various places in the basin are going to have various impacts. And as Bill mentioned earlier, the spatial relative location of all existing rights is going to have impacts, right? If you pack a bunch of wells into a small area, then comparing that against the basin-wide water budget, if the whole basin could redistribute water quickly across, the whole spatial extent, that would be easy to do, but the speed at which the recharge is redistributed makes it hard to account for that in our assessments. So hope that made sense, but the short answer is we did that in order to take the cannot be determined box off the groundwater review form.
Right.
Yeah, so my understanding is that, if somebody submits under these rules, if somebody submits a new application and there's a finding that groundwater is over appropriated, then that's a denial. It's going to result in a denial. Okay, and it also seems that the way this is written, that anytime the proposed aquifer is determined to be hydraulically connected to a nearby stream that's already over appropriated, that will result in a finding of the groundwater is over appropriated, resulting in a denial. And when you consider that nearly all of the surface water in the state is already over appropriated, save for the Willamette River, and maybe there's a couple of others that I'm not aware of. Then that just simply by virtue of determining that a proposed well is hydraulically connected to a nearby stream is going to right then and there in one sweep result in a denial of an application. And that's going to apply. I mean, it seems like that's going to apply to the vast majority of applications that you will be receiving. That's what is written here now. And we've had a lot of discussion about, kind of giving the impression that the department's going to be making these very, careful in-depth analyses of potential interference and so forth. But, really, I fail to see how often that there's even going to be a need for any kind of in-depth analysis. We talk about the determination that groundwater use will impair or interfere must be based on substantial evidence. Well, all we're going to be relying on for 90% of the cases is going to be a determination of hydraulic connection. So I guess the question is, how do you see, all this other discussion and all these other things that are going to be in the rules about how you're going to evaluate, potential interference or whatever? How does that fit in with this?
Yeah, okay. Good question. We're getting to the public comment and we've got 2 more online, so we're going to go to that. I think we're going to come back and talk about this a lot, especially in the Division 9 part. And my answer, if I had time to give it, was a combination of how I responded to Susan and Adam. So yeah.
Okay, Dave and then Robin.
This is Dave Wildman. It just seems like with the revision that we're making in 11B, we may not be addressing deep confined basalt aquifers that are not necessarily connected to a surface water source or a over appropriated surface water source. So something to think about in that process.
Yeah, and again, I'll say B and C are aimed at getting at the 2 sources of water to well, capture and storage. And so the basalt example would be caught in C. You're right, B would not likely affect deep basalt applications. C would be the controlling assessment in that case.
Okay.
Robin, and then we're going to go to public comment. And if you are a member of the public who is here and would like to submit a comment, please either put your name in the chat or raise your hand. But we'll go to Robin first.
Yeah, I just have a question about paragraph D and the processing of applications. So does this mean that if an application had already been submitted, but not reviewed yet, anytime between 1992 and now, would these new rules apply rather than the rules that were in place at the time of the application?
These rules would apply to applications received after the effective date of the rules. So applications received prior to the effective date would be processed under the current approach that we talked about earlier.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, is there anyone who has, Sarah, I see your comment and I will come back to it, but I first want to go to public comment. Is there anyone here who's a member of the public that has a comment that, or a question even, that they'd like to share? I am not seeing any. So, Sarah, please go ahead.
Sure. I only made the comment in the comments section because I thought we were moving on, but I wanted to respond, and I can't tell who's talking in the room since the camera went down, but I wanted to respond to the comment that subsection C would apply to confined aquifers, not subsection B. If that's the intent of this, then it needs to say so in the rule, because right now OWRD is consistently finding confined aquifers hydraulically connected to surface water sources. And so, as it's written, B would say that those deep confined aquifers will not allow new appropriations if the surface water source is hydraulically connected and over appropriated, and surface water sources can be over appropriated in certain months and not others. And so this is just saying if there's any over appropriation, the groundwater application must be denied. And that basically looks like 100% of the applications to me. And so I really agree with, I believe it was Greg's comment about how if this is in the rule, what's the point of everything else? Because this is what's going to end all the applications. Thanks.
Thank you for that comment, Sarah. And you were correct in voice identifying Greg Capillas with Pacific Hydrology.
I know his voice. Hi, Greg.
And I apologize
Don't
for
we
not
all?
identifying myself.
And sorry, this is Justin Iverson. I made the response to the comment from Dave, and I would say that if I conflated confined and hydraulically connected or not, I did not mean to. Confined aquifers can be hydraulically connected. This gets back to the scale issue and our definitions versus that's professional judgment of the reviewer. There's some time scale at which water is going to flow, and we need to think about functional time scales. And so with respect to Columbia River basalt in the Columbia Plateau, where you drill and seal deep, there are areas where the stream flow depletion or capture portion of the source of water to wells is very low and storage dominates. And that is the place in which C would control, and B is very true. I don't disagree with what Greg said. I think that I would say that we always go through all the analyses and provide an opinion on all those things. I would say that best available information and assessment would still come into a hydraulic connection, PSI, and then SI, substantial interference determination. And yes, right now, most surface water is over allocated, and the rights that we've issued up to this point are having some impact in the priority system. And I would ask the question, as a matter of policy, given a prior appropriation system for a hydraulically connected well, should we be issuing new water rights with 2023 or beyond priority dates that are going to impact over appropriated streams where senior users are being regulated back? So we have not set a threshold, just foreshadowing up the Division 9 right now, as it's made. We've taken out these thresholds that we had in the past that said we're going to not issue some water rights that have a defined acute short-term impacts, but we will keep issuing groundwater rights that we know, like we are issuing junior water rights that we know are going to impact senior users that are being regulated off. And it's, you know, the only recourse to that is to curtail back with a critical area. And so essentially, with our overall goal of being more sustainable and protective of existing users, that's the route that we propose. And it's very true, like, but even Sarah had pointed out.
All right, we have, okay, I also want to acknowledge, I think Rex is a member of the public who is here.
Yeah, that's correct. There
Go
needs,
ahead and make your comments. And we'll come back to you, Susan. Rex, go ahead.
okay, there needs to be a carve out for the Deschutes Basin where we already have a mitigation program that accounts for the hydraulic connection.
Okay, we appreciate your comment. Was that the only comment you wanted to offer, Rex?
Right now,
Okay, thank you. Susan.
Susan Smith from Willamette University. This is very much a lawyerly comment, which is, I'm a little uncomfortable about defining over appropriated in the way that we do in B, because then we talk about the groundwater source that's connected to already over appropriated surface water as per the definition in section 9. It's an awkward construction. So I think we can put on that.
Okay.
So just to be fair, are you suggesting that we bring D up above A since D affects A and have the surface water components as AB and then the groundwater components as CB?
I think the use of the same word over appropriated to define over appropriated is in general bad practice. And I think the lawyerly fix to that, I'm not sure is the one that you described, but I'm confident that the department can do it.
Thank you for that comment. We will take a look at it. Are there any other comments from anyone for today? And I actually think it will make sense once we walk through Division 8 and Division 9 to then come back and take another look at some of these sort of higher level in terms of dependency, so that you can understand. So it makes more sense on how it all fits together. Misty.
Thank you. I feel like I should understand this better and I don't, so forgive me, but who determines the hydraulic connection? And is there a giant database of determinations that have already been made, or is somebody making it on a case-by-case basis? And if they're making it on a case-by-case basis, is it their personal opinion at that snapshot in time, or is it kind of based on some kind of like case law, like a previous determination, you know, that so-and-so did their research and they made this determination, and based on their research, I'm making my determination? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Misty. Go ahead, Justin.
So Misty, so the department's hydrogeologists make that determination as part of the groundwater technical review. The determination is based on substantial evidence in the record. So we look at overall the geologic setting, hydrogeologic setting, and primarily one of the big pieces of evidence is water levels in wells compared to the surface water level. And if a hydraulic gradient exists that drives surface water, or excuse me, groundwater to discharge to surface water. So I'm not going to flip back, but if you bring up in your mind those block diagrams, the water table elevation at the left of the block diagram was higher than the stream. And it's that elevation difference that drives groundwater flow to the stream. And that's one of the primary things we look at. So if the water table is below stream level, then that's evidence that there's this unsaturated zone in between, and the location of the water table as it changes isn't going to affect seepage from the stream under those conditions.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments today? Deb, I do see your comment in the chat, indicating that water planning in Benton County is needed, and suggestions for individuals who have experience in assessing water issues and facilitating comprehensive planning processes are welcome. Zach.
Yeah, I just have one last thing to say. I'll rephrase my earlier question as a recommendation or suggestion. I think given the data scarcity around the state with respect to monitoring wells and with respect to the ability to evaluate hydraulic connection where we have that available data, I would suggest that we also keep and retain the idea that appropriating groundwater resources exceeding the average annual recharge to a groundwater source should be kept, because we don't have, as you said, Annette, we don't have that information in many of our groundwater source basins or watersheds, but we do have that information in places like the Willamette, the Deschutes, the Harney, the Klamath, and soon the Umatilla or Walla Walla. So I think I would just propose that as an extra layer of possible caution, in addition to the existing added text for B and C, I would propose retaining that idea of discharge exceeding recharge to be a condition for over appropriation.
Okay, thank you for that comment. We'll take a look at that. Any other comments for today? All right, we will go to Laura then to talk about next steps and wrap up. I really appreciate the discussion, and we do have some follow-up items that we will start our next meeting with. So thank you for that.
Yeah, okay, so as far as next steps, because we have kind of a quick turnaround time, we ask that if you have input regarding the draft rules that we went over today, if you could provide those to us by the 26th, that way we can evaluate and incorporate those suggestions, because we will go back over some of what we went over today to the extent we get input and determine that we need to make some revisions. And then also, if you have suggestions on how to improve the meeting logistics beyond like making sure we can get the cameras to work. I'm sorry, I have no idea what's going on. Hopefully it wasn't too disruptive. We'll try and fix it for next time. And then our next RAC meeting, it's gonna, follow the same format of May 10th, 8:30 to noon-ish. With a 11:30 scheduled public hearing or public comment period, meeting up here as well as on Zoom. I think 400, Division 400 and Division 8 are what we're
We
planning.
did cover 400 today.
Yeah,
So
okay.
we'll schedule out which
Yeah.
comes next, because I think it makes more sense to come back to Division 400 after we've gone through some of the other cases that
410
affected.
yeah. So, yeah, and expect to see more emails from me with meeting attachments for our next meeting. I think that's all I have. If anybody had any questions about next steps or scheduling.
Misty.
Thank you. Is all of the information that we were provided available in a central location linked from your website?
It is, it's the rulemaking website. I will, when I send out, so I'll go ahead and just send out an email just with the rulemaking web link. I know my meeting invites had a lot of information in them, but we have a proposed rulemaking website. And then on that website, we have a page dedicated specifically to the groundwater allocation. And we've tried to break things in terms of, we've got background material on there, and then we have materials that relate to each of our RAC meetings that we post up there as well. But I'll go ahead and send that back out to folks, so it's easier.
And everything we received is all public information. There's nothing that's confidential in any way.
Nothing's confidential.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, suggestions before we adjourn for today? Thank you all for your time. We really appreciate it and we appreciate your contributions. So look forward to seeing you on the 10th of May.
Thank you.